Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie Ostwalt. Thanksgiving, one of our beloved traditions and holidays. Many of us celebrate Thanksgiving each year, and this holiday has evolved into a mixture of rituals and beliefs that are part religion, part culture, and part myth. My guest today, Dr. Timothy Silver, is an American historian who has just completed work on his latest book on environmental history and the Civil War. And Tim will help us unpack many of the beliefs, true and false, surrounding one of our favorite American traditions, Thanksgiving. Hello, Tim. Thanks for joining us today.
It's good to be here, especially on the verge of a holiday.
I know, it's right around the corner. I know our students are already packing up and leaving a little bit early sometimes, but Thanksgiving is this week. And I want to get to that, but I want to give you a chance first to just tell us a little bit about yourself, how long you've been here at App, and what you like to teach and write about.
Well, I've been at Appalachian for a long time. This is my 36th year, and I teach in the history department, American history. And my particular specialty is environmental history. I study people and nature over time. And I teach courses on wilderness and nature in American life. I teach a course on the history of national parks, and most recently a course on animals, people, and history. So it's a combination of sort of the human world and the natural world.
Right.
And I try to see how the two fit together and that kind of thing.
And of course you have a couple of books out already, and this one coming up.
Right.
Yeah. Tell us about your previous books.
Well, my first book, which is like every professor's, was the dissertation turned into a book, was about how European colonization changed the landscape and the ecology in the southeastern part of the United States. And that came out in 1990. And then in 2003, I always joke I'd do a book every decade and a half, whether I need to or not.
Right.
In 2003, I wrote a book about Mount Mitchell and the Black Mountains and environmental history of that region. And this latest book is co-authored with a colleague of mine, Judkin Browning, who's a military historian. And we sort of put our heads together and tried to take a look at the Civil War as an environmental event and an ecological event.
Yeah, so we have an image here of the cover. Of course, this book is not quite out yet. Due out in the spring, I believe, with
Should be out
UNC Press. Right?
Mid-April.
Yeah.
UNC Press. You can pre-order on Amazon.
There you go. I have already looked it up. Before we get to Thanksgiving, just tell us a little bit about. It's a fascinating thesis. We chatted a little bit beforehand. Tell us a little bit about the perspective on with this book, because I think it's creative and unique. And I think you said it adds to the 50,000 or so titles on the Civil War that are already published.
Yeah, the Civil War is the most written about event in American history, as you might imagine. In fact, there's something on the order of 55,000 books, and that's the equivalent of one a day since Lee's surrender at Appomattox.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's been, so why another book on the Civil War, right? But we like to think we have a different perspective. We've tried to reimagine the war as what you might call a biological or a biotic event, and an important event in the ecology and the environmental history of the United States. And we look at things like disease, weather, food, animals. We look at sort of what I would call the ecology of death. The Civil War brought death on an unprecedented scale, and you had Americans suddenly had to deal with all the biology of decomposition and dealing with bodies of both people and animals.
Right.
And then we look at terrain, how the terrain affected the war, and how war in turn affected the terrain. And then the last part of the book is a kind of an epilogue of the enduring environmental legacy of the Civil War.
Yeah. So this was the war itself was an environmental catastrophe, I guess you might call it, or at least
in Eastern America particularly, but there were also Western campaigns in the war, but particularly in the East, it was hard on the natural world. And really changed it in a lot of important ways.
Right. I mean, you said that there was maybe a diary entry from a soldier who said that the landscape looked like a a scourge of locusts had come through, or
Right,
kind of a
right.
biblical allusion.
You had these huge armies.
Right.
You know, for example, when George McClellan landed on the Virginia Peninsula in 1862, he had 110,000 men. He had something on the order of 40,000 horses, hundreds of cattle and hogs. And, you know, that's, if you look at that through an environmental historian's lens, that's a kind of a mass mammalian
Right,
migration. You know, it's like the wildebeest on the Serengeti or something moving around. And, you know, it has all kinds of effects. That was bigger than any city in Virginia. You had problems with waste disposal. You had to have campfires. You had to have fires for cooking, wood to build fortifications. And you're right, when an army had been across an area, it was like a plague of locusts almost. Something of biblical proportions, certainly.
Right, right. Well, I can't wait for the book to come out. I'm looking forward to having a chance to read it. And I think since we're talking about the Civil War, it provides us actually a good segue to Thanksgiving. Many people may or may not know that Abraham Lincoln issued a proclamation of national Thanksgiving during the Civil War.
Right.
And I pulled out a couple of quotes from that proclamation. I just wanted to share them with you and with our audience. I'm sure you've read it, so this will be familiar with you, to you. But Lincoln references the province of Almighty God. He references our Most High God. He proclaims a day of thanksgiving and praise to our beneficent Father who dwelleth in the heavens. This is language that we wouldn't hear an American president use in an address today, I would imagine.
No, but probably not, although, you know, frequently presidents have referred to God. And if you go back a little bit, George Washington actually, right after the Constitution was ratified, proclaimed a day of Thanksgiving, which is really odd since it had been ratified with the First Amendment.
Right.
Which,
right.
But I don't think he was talking about any specific practice of religion, just a general day of Thanksgiving.
Right.
And you're right, Lincoln did that right in the middle of the Civil War in October of 1863, after Union victories, by the way, at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, which he thought had begun to turn the war around.
So you think there was an implied connection with the kind of more optimistic view of the course of the war and then this National Day of Thanksgiving?
I think so.
Yeah.
Most things that Lincoln did were calculated for political effect. And this speech was actually written, we think, by his Secretary of State, William H. Seward. And so when he starts talking about the providential God, and there's thanks in there for the bountiful harvest. And despite the fact that these guns were going off and the landscape was being torn apart, agriculture was doing pretty well in the north. The interesting part of that is, meanwhile, the South was starving.
Right.
So to sort of thank God for that was a not maybe so subtle dig at the South.
Right.
And,
right.
You know, a plea for national unity.
Yeah, so we've got Washington declaring a day of Thanksgiving shortly after the First Amendment is passed. We've got Lincoln using religious language to deliver a message that is at least subtly political. So is Thanksgiving a religious or a civil holiday?
Well, that's a really good question.
Yeah.
And the two have been so closely tied together that it's sometimes difficult to tell. But I think in the custom of giving thanks, that's always been, you know, connected with religion. You know, you give thanks to God. Now, in terms of national unity and sort of everybody giving thanks at the same time,
Right.
I think that makes it more of a political holiday. And it also kind of forces Americans in a way to think about history, to think about their history. We do that on a lot of holidays, but Thanksgiving is one where we look back to colonial times and think about that.
Well, Thanksgiving is tied specifically to American history, unlike
Right.
some holiday like Easter or Christmas, which
Right.
are, I guess, more specifically religious in their content. But Thanksgiving does have these connections, rightly or wrongly, to specific events in American history. So when was the first Thanksgiving? We were talking about this earlier. I guess the most commonly held view is that the Thanksgiving or the Feast of 1621 in Plymouth Plantation was the original Thanksgiving feast, but there's some question about that, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the one we celebrate.
And I think we have actually an image here, artwork here that we can superimpose here. Yeah, so this is representative of that feast.
Yeah, that's the one that we celebrate. There are other claims to the first Thanksgiving. I know of 4 earlier claims. There are 2 in Texas from Spanish explorers in the 16th century who celebrated success or overcoming hardship with feasts of Thanksgiving. And there's one in St. Augustine, Florida, near the end of the 16th century, end of the 1500s, that claims to be or I believe it's actually 1565.
It's very early then.
Very early. Claims to be a feast of Thanksgiving. And then there's one that has a pretty good claim to be a real Thanksgiving in 1619, just pretty near Jamestown, Virginia, a place called Berkeley 100.
Right.
But the one that we celebrate is the one in 1621.
Yeah. So this would probably have been, let's just talk about that one then. This would have been a harvest festival, I guess, which is not uncommon among communities, religious and otherwise, to commemorate a successful harvest. Is that what precipitated this, or was there something else in relations with Native Americans? Or
It was a harvest celebration, and we don't exactly know when it took place. Sometime between late September and probably mid-November, we think. We know that it went on for 3 days, at least, so it was a long kind of festival type, not just a one-day celebration. And it was done, we believe, to not just commemorate the harvest, but to sort of celebrate those who had survived a year in the New World. The previous winter had been incredibly hard, disease-ridden for the people who had come on the Mayflower. In fact, if you look at that picture, it's historically accurate in the sense that you don't see a lot of women in the picture. From what we can tell, only about 4 women were there, and that's because about 78% of the women had been wiped out by disease.
Really?
That came to the colony in the previous year. And there were probably about 25 or so men, and about that many English teenagers and children.
At the
celebration, right. And then at least that many Native Americans from the Wampanoag tribe.
Right.
And in most of the time, I tell students that there were probably more Native people there than English people.
Right.
And that kind of casts a different light on it, I think, as a celebration.
Well, and the natives had played an important role in helping the settlers survive that winter. Is that correct, or is that part of the mythology?
Yeah, they learned from them, and without them, they might not have survived. Some of that is mythology, and the Wampanoag were probably at Plymouth at that particular time because that's when they conducted their diplomatic missions with other groups of Indians.
Right.
And so they were just in the area at the time and carrying on, diplomacy with the Puritans, negotiating with Plymouth.
What I understand is that a man named Edward Winslow, I believe, wrote a treatise or collected and edited a volume called Mort's Relation. And this is where he describes, or at least the most famous description of Thanksgiving is in that book.
Yeah, and it's very short, and it was, I think, actually a letter that he sent to someone, and he describes the event, and from that we get a little bit of a hint of what went on, and particularly about the menu a little bit.
Right, yeah.
He mentions that before the celebration, a group went fowling, F-O-W-L-I-N-G, which is bird hunting.
Right.
And so turkey might have been a part of that, wild turkey.
Yeah.
And certainly things like ducks, swans, geese, almost anything that flew was fair game.
Yeah.
We also think pumpkins, that are part of our traditional Thanksgiving fare.
Right.
Corn, but maybe not in the sense that we think of it. We think of eating corn on the cob or creamed corn or something, probably pounded into meal and cooked as a kind of corn cake.
Yeah.
But those kinds of things are pretty spot on. From our current sort of traditional Thanksgiving menu. Yeah.
So I've read also that the natives brought venison.
Yeah.
That they went out and killed some deer, and that was a mainstay of that first celebration.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, venison was a mainstay of the diet of native people and colonists too, when they could get it. So venison would have been part of that.
Do we have any idea how turkey became the predominant food? I mean, it's really interesting to me that is the meat, right? Or that's the protein. How did that become part of the cultural tradition to such an extent that it wasn't even I know he mentioned birds, but turkey wasn't mentioned in that original description.
No, I don't. I'm not really sure how turkey got to be that way. I do know that it was at least in place, in the early 20th century, I think, as a kind of a traditional Thanksgiving fare. And I do know that John Kennedy, as president, pardoned the first turkey on Thanksgiving.
And presidents still do that, is that
right?
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, that's fun. That's a fun tradition.
Right.
Now, you mentioned that 78% of the women died that first winter.
Right.
I had not heard that statistic. Is there something particular about the type of disease that ran through that colony that hit women hard? Or?
Yeah, we can't say for sure what it was, what kind of disease it was. There are all sorts of possibilities, everything from, some sort of bacterial or viral infection to maybe a dietary problem. But for whatever reason, it seems to have hit the women particularly hard in the colony. And so in part, the Thanksgiving, as we think about it, what we think of as Thanksgiving, was also a celebration of survival, not just the harvest.
Yeah, so a good number, I don't even think the majority, but a fair number of those early settlers were Puritans.
Yes.
It's interesting that the Puritans weren't really fond of feasting celebrations.
Right.
So they were more apt to be fasting and praying. Did the feast part of it get overblown in our mythology, or was that indicative that there were others there besides the Puritans?
Well, I think one of the reasons we celebrate the one in 1621 is because of that. It was kind of a departure from the norm.
Right.
For Puritans. And the other ones that I mentioned, the ones particularly in Texas and in Florida, would have been celebrated by Catholic settlers and explorers. And in Catholicism, it's one of the reasons we're not sure if they were exactly Thanksgiving or harvest celebrations, because it's tradition in Catholicism to celebrate regular religious feast days. And so some of those might have just been a regular kind of feast day that was celebrated. And the one in Virginia, too, I mean, that was Anglican, which could have been the same thing. But because the Puritans departed from that tradition of not celebrating feast days, I think that's the one we've seized on because it was unusual.
So that's really interesting. So the feast days would have been a regular part of the Catholic liturgical calendar.
Sure.
Would have been a regular part of the Anglican liturgical calendar, but the Puritans, not so much.
Right.
Yeah, so this was a significant event in their life to have been such a departure. So the 1619 Thanksgiving in Berkeley, right?
Berkeley,
near Jamestown. What was that like? Was it smaller, or just did they not have good PR people, or why do we not hear about that one?
Well, Virginians will tell you that was the first one. There's an old joke about Virginians that, how many Virginians does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is that it takes 3, one to change the bulb and 2 to talk about how good the old one was. So Virginians are, they're into their history, but we don't really know a whole lot about that one, except that it was a feast of Thanksgiving for safe arrival. They came on a ship called the Margaret, I believe.
Okay.
And so it was a celebration of survival and Thanksgiving, much like the one in New England. But for whatever reason, and I think it's owing partly to the Puritan kind of divergence from the norm,
Right.
but also to the publicity that it got coming out of New England, and then in subsequent years, New England historians played that up.
Yeah.
So.
Well, in the couple minutes we have left, I have another image that, if we can get on the screen back here, has become associated with Thanksgiving in contemporary America, and this is Norman Rockwell's painting. I think, if I'm right, this was one of 4 in a series of paintings he did based on a speech that Franklin Roosevelt gave about the 4 freedoms. And this is entitled Freedom from Want, I believe. But this is kind of the classic image we get of Thanksgiving today, right? The family gathered around the table, the big turkey, and so forth.
Right.
Yeah, is this going to be your family at Thanksgiving?
Well, we're going to spend it with my wife's family, and actually that looks pretty accurate. The hairstyles are off a little bit.
Well, yeah, I guess it is. Yeah, this is more mid-century.
Yeah, that sort of has that post-war prosperity feel about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So what's the most enduring thing you think that Thanksgiving contributes to American life? Is it the sense of unity that all Americans are most Americans are gathered together doing a similar thing on this one day?
I think that's it, and I think it is an American holiday, as you said. It's not celebrated in other parts of the world. It is our holiday.
Yeah.
And it reminds us of that early history, and then it's been tied in with shopping and football over the years. So that's helped to kind of entrench it in our culture.
Right.
But I think it goes back to the idea of on that one day, Americans do things and remember their history.
Huh.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. I appreciate you coming and helping us unpack some of this, and I do hope you have a safe trip and a wonderful Thanksgiving celebration this week.
Yeah, well, hope you do too, and thanks for having me.
Sure, thank you. And that's it for Religion and Life this week and for this season. Thank you for being loyal viewers this year, and make sure you watch for brand new episodes of Religion and Life on App TV in the spring. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwalt.